Hi, and welcome to my soapbox. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, female monsters, specifically female-led monster movies. So if that's something you're interested in, please stay tuned. The underrated monster coming of age 2009 horror flick Jennifer's Body is nearly identical to that of the Canadian 2000s indie film Ginger Snaps. Both films focus on the female experience. Not only are these visual similarities, but the story and character tropes are practically mirrored. Typically, I take issue with films being copycats of pre-existing media and being passed off as new and a super personal story from the writer. However, Jennifer's Body needs to exist despite its older twin, Ginger Snaps. Ginger Snaps was created by men who wanted to make a monster movie that had strong social commentary and written by a woman. It was written by a woman, Karen Walton, whose experience as a woman really reads through. Jennifer's Body was created by a woman who wanted to directly and metaphorically express her experience. Both films touch on the same topics. Both films struggled before they had a chance to take off, and both films still do not get the recognition they deserve. The film Ginger Snaps follows two death-obsessed sisters that are outcasts in their suburban neighborhood and must deal with the tragic consequences when one of them is bitten by a deadly werewolf. Right as Ginger Snaps was beginning pre-production, the Columbine shooting happened. There was a general consensus to stay away from teen or school-based violence out of respect to the victims, their families, and all people who were affected. When the film was being shopped around, it was misinterpreted and labeled teen violence. Studios all around Canada refused to even look into it. When they did finally have a backer, they were still limited. During the casting process, a lot of actresses liked the script, liked the stories, liked the characters, but didn't want to be associated with teen violence. And it wasn't just the issue of getting people involved. Their main location being a high school was difficult to book, and it took a lot of convincing to get access to a campus. Later, when the film was being released, many theaters refused to play it. Many theaters in the US and Canada refused to play it because the media had already painted it in that negative light. The film would find better recognition in other countries, mostly Eastern, and later would become a cult classic among horror fans everywhere. The reason the film still did well and holds up today is because it's a good story. It's well written, and the performance of the main actresses really sells the bond that the two sisters have for each other, making the danger all that more scary. But it isn't exploitative of young women and their sexuality. For the most part, the violence in the film really takes a backseat to the dramatics. Yes, there is gore and imagery of blood, but it's not used as a tool, but rather an accessory. If you take out the blood, there's still a good story and a solid movie. The writer of Jennifer's Body, Diablo Cody, felt the need to express the stress of being a woman in a society and industry that has ridiculous expectations put on women from a young age, and to showcase how sex is often used against women. The story follows Jennifer, played by Megan Fox, a teenager who begins to turn into a succubus who specializes in killing her male classmates, and her best friend Needy, played by Amanda Seyfried, who tries to put an end to the horror. Megan Fox was already a household name, but most only knew her from tabloids and eye candy movie posters. From Mary-Kate and Ashley to Transformers, throughout Fox's career, she's been used as a prop to showcase beauty and sex. Her casting in this film was an opportunity for her to take her power back, in a sense. The film centering around the friendship and relationship of two high school girls, one of which is becoming a bloodthirsty monster and the other is exploring her sexuality. The label sex and violence was placed on the film before the first trailer released. Because of Fox's representation by the media, the trailer houses leaned heavy into that, using the most erotic shots allowed to air on mainstream television. The film was made for young girls and women, but was advertised to heterosexual boys and men. While shooting the film, the actresses were aware of how certain scenes were going to be misconstrued, and unfortunately, they were right. The film wouldn't find its audience until well after its theatrical release. Similarly to Ginger Snaps, a small group of people saw the film and saw the film for what it was and began changing the narrative that the media had forced. And then, very quickly, the film became a cult favorite, especially among the young women and girls of whom it was meant for. When thinking about the similarities in these movies, I found myself comparing any female-led monster, horror, action, sci-fi, thriller, slasher type movie. Monster movies in general follow a similar formula. Character A is in the middle of a life transformation, and after something happens to them, they also go through a physical transformation, while character B is innocent and fearful and finds the strength to save themselves and others. However, more specifically, the female monster movies formula focuses a lot more on society's expectation of women and the fears surrounding the exploration of womanhood. This goes all the way back to the classic Universal monster films. From the time of silent films, women have been given very specific rules. They were meant to be beautiful and in full control of their emotions, the way every good average woman should be. In the film adaptation of Frankenstein in the 1930s, Mae Clarke, who played Elizabeth, had to be very careful with how she portrayed distress. The use of the hand on the cheek was the symbol of terror, because women weren't meant to scream and cry. And to show that in a performance would give the notion that the average woman doesn't need to be calm and collected all the time. The visual of the main female character retaining her beauty despite the horrors around her is a trope that continues to have an effect on storytelling today. (1950s). Here's a look at how female-led monster movies have been interpreted throughout history. 1930s. When you see or hear the title of a movie and it's the character, you'd expect that they are the primary focus of the story. However, in The Bride of Frankenstein, the bride is a reference to both Dr. Frankenstein's bride-to-be and the monster's mate. Due to the title association, Frankenstein being the monster, generally audiences attribute the title Bride of Frankenstein to being the monster's mate. And so, if she were the title character, does it make sense that she is not seen until the end of the film? The story follows some men who are trying to build the perfect woman. Her pieces are chosen specifically because they are considered the most beautiful. Immediately, she rejects her sole purpose of being a man's object and is immediately destroyed. 1940s. In the film Cat People, Irina is a young Serbian woman who lives in fear from the legends told by her people that once she is intimate with her partner, she herself will become a cat person, or more explicitly, a vicious, vindictive monster. The idea of losing your innocence when being romantic with a partner and the fear that is put onto women for what their life would mean to society once they have had sex is strongly represented in this film. In the 1950s, throughout history, film has been used as a way to talk about social issues and concerns. For example, the original King Kong, 1933, was a metaphor for white men being afraid that black men were going to take away and ruin white women. Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, 1958, could be interpreted as a metaphor for men being worried about what if our wives retaliated when we cheat and gaslight them. 1960s. Around this time, the demand for monster movies had mostly fizzled out. Eastern productions were, however, still exploring those stories. One of the big monster movies that still happened to fall into the formula of the female monster was the 1961 Japanese film Mothra. Based on the English dubbed and Western advertising of Mothra, it can be interpreted as women will be protected by a beautiful creature when men try to take them away, so beware the temptations of an exotic woman. 1970s. With Carrie, 1976, we still have the embodiment of the femme monster, but also a touch of the female experience. While having been a popular Stephen King novel, a lot of the fan base does stem from the film adaptations. Either way, it follows the same format as other films, where the title character is a young innocent who grows into something powerful and sinister, with the source of her power being that she is becoming a woman. End of the 70s, the 1980s, and the 1990s. Horror was finding its place in the entertainment world again, but the approach, while different, still held close to the formula. The monsters are slowly becoming less literal and more human, and when they are still literal monsters, they have a very sexual nature to them, making their attacks more like human crimes. And this creates a shift in where the main female character goes, This is the time where the female lead isn't the damsel in distress, but rather the hero. She is the strength, intelligence, beauty, and innocence of the story, whose transformation was less external and more internal. In the action sci-fi world, you had Ellen Ripley in Alien, 1979, Sarah Connor in Terminator, 1984, and in horror you had Laurie Strode in Halloween, 1978, Alice Hardy, Friday the 13th, 1980, and Nancy Thompson in A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. The characters being women was not meant to be social commentary or to make a huge statement about female empowerment. It was storytelling that happened to work. This created a second successful formula known as the final girl. The final girl, however, is used specifically when dealing with survival-based action, slasher, thriller type movies and stories. I believe there are two ways of looking at the use of a final girl. One, it's super badass that a woman is the lone survivor and the powerhouse of the film. Or two, the character only exists and is only winning because that's what she is supposed to do. There is nothing really special about her. There was no final girl pre the early 2000s. Instead, they were called the lead, the protagonist, the star. They existed in the same place that male stars had been in for years. One of the only survival-based films made after the 80s that genuinely allowed the female lead to be just that, the lead, was Scream in 1996. The sequels and other films made around and after that time took the female lead and minimized her down to a trope. Later in the 2010s, films like You're Next, Hush, and Ready or Not allowed their leads who happen to be women be leads without the final girl narrative. 1990s to mid-2010s. There is another shift in the female monster formula, where the female monster becomes a full-on villain. A young girl or woman scorned, usually by a man, uses her otherworldly powers to appear in the form of a ghoulish spirit, demon, and torments people. It is a more exaggerated take on the fragility of the femme creature from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It is no longer about the human experience, but rather innocence fighting against hate born out of trauma. One of the films that was released during this time was Bride of Chucky, where the story is so similar to the original female monster formula that the character Tiffany is watching the Bride of Frankenstein, leading up to the action that causes her to become the lead female monster. But because of the times, the story still feels it fits in with the far-reaching films of the 2000s. Tiffany is the perfect mix of all the tropes created. She is a femme creature who is motivated by actions of a man and gradually becomes more sinister. However, unlike Ginger Snaps and Jennifer's Body, Tiffany chooses to step into the monster role. It's not something she needs to survive against, but rather something she can wield like a weapon. While she doesn't ask for her fate, she does choose to accept it in a way that other characters in this trope try to fight until the very end. Thank you so much for listening to my soapbox ramblings on my interests and curiosities when it comes to female-led monster movies. Also, sorry for that last segment where you can clearly hear a cat wanting to play in the background.